Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar entitled Your Top 5 Privileged Identity Audit Traps and How to Avoid Them. My name is Paul Del Piero and I'm with Lieberman Software Corporation. I'll be your presenter today. Today our agenda includes a very brief overview of privileged accounts, a countdown of your top 5 audit traps including symptoms that can tell you if your organization might be at risk, examples of the relevant auditor guidelines that are meant to keep your organization safe, a discussion of how most organizations deal with the threats, along with some typical outcomes and a customer story or two. We'll then describe some automation shortcuts that can lower the costs and IT staff times needed to secure your privileged accounts. But first, let's provide that brief overview of privileged accounts. As you probably know, privileged accounts are identities that have elevated permission to access potentially sensitive data, run programs, and change configuration settings. Privileged accounts are like the keys to the kingdom of IT, and they're found almost everywhere, on virtually all computers, appliances, and software. These accounts might be known as administrator or root on your computer operating systems, as SA or sysadmin on databases, and so on. Now, privileged accounts are the most powerful logins on your network, yet they're rarely changed in most organizations and are typically known to many individuals. Privileged accounts are usually not subject to the same levels of accountability and auditing you'd get with normal user logins, because they're not managed by your existing identity and access management systems. So with that, let's introduce 5 common pitfalls that can lead to failed IT compliance audits and data loss, your top 5 audit traps. In compiling this top 5 list, we used a combination of public data breach records, information direct from our customers, guidance from the latest IT regulatory standards, along with some in-depth results from our own risk assessment reports, and we'll talk more about that later. And so, starting off at number 5 is a common security lapse that we'll call the attribution trap. We'll define the attribution trap as any of your processes that make it impossible for you to attribute privileged access, including access that could allow viewing of sensitive data or changing of configuration settings, to a named individual. The symptoms of this trap are not difficult to recognize. For example, if your organization relies on spreadsheet files and printouts to record its administrator and root logins, or if you find that your staff use built-in administrator accounts more frequently than you'd expect, if you've ever seen audit logs and password lists suggesting that privileged logins are seldom changed, or if your organization relies on IT staff to manually track who did what when using these privileged logins, your organization might be at risk. And if you're involved with IT audits, you probably know that today's requirements have plenty to say about your need for attribution, especially when it comes to the sharing of highly privileged logins and tying individual users to actions they take using privileged credentials. Today we see that a great many companies attempt to deal with these risks by issuing written policies and expecting IT staff to comply. We also find plenty of cases where organizations ignore warning signs that there are too few controls and hope that the auditors won't notice or will grant exceptions. Typical outcomes for organizations that fail to deal with these risks can start with the repeated use of privileged logins for the wrong purposes and unexpected people accessing sensitive data. To put some real numbers around this, in a recent survey conducted by our company, 78% of IT professionals admitted that they could walk out of the office and take highly sensitive information with them. Yet without attribution, there's no way to tie that data loss to any one individual. In addition, you'll find that organizations that rely on password files and printed lists to record privileged logins face delays in granting IT staff the access they need to keep systems running and can face unexpected auditing costs when they try to document who has privileged access. Now, here's an example of a customer that was able to create a climate of accountability. This comes from the U.S. government, where an agency's own investigators found proof that an employee had accessed sensitive information to which he was not entitled. Here, the executives made the decision to provide a lasting fix and get real attribution of all privileged access, to know for certain that employees were complying with important policies. The organization partnered with our company to automate their privileged account management, and we'll talk more later about the processes that they used. Our next risky practice is something we'll call the DIY or do-it-yourself trap. We'll define the DIY trap as any of your processes that lack the efficiency, scale, and resilience to secure your network against external and internal threats. If your organization is suffering from these sorts of challenges, you've probably found that IT staff are spending too much of their time on ad hoc system management tasks instead of more strategic projects. There's a small number of trained staff who are carrying out ad hoc processes or developing scripts to manage privileged account security. Yet there are probably quite a few undocumented workarounds to handle difficult edge conditions, and you're probably not getting anything near complete coverage. These sorts of workarounds might include use of a single service account to authenticate numerous unrelated processes, or maybe relying on service and embedded application credentials that never change, out of fear of a lockout or service disruption. You'll find that all of the major regulatory guidelines also address this issue, either directly or by setting standards that would be almost impossible to meet by manual and scripted means. And as we've said, organizations that practice too much do-it-yourself security rely heavily on those scripts and ad hoc processes to complete their routine management tasks, ignore those accounts that can't be easily secured, and so leave some big security holes. And they assume that auditors won't notice or will grant exceptions. Unfortunately, the result of DIY processes is that everyone involved with the scripting and manual changes knows these highly privileged credentials, so you've lost attribution and the ability to tie actions to individual users. Organizations also find it more difficult to document ad hoc processes, and this can lead to service problems in the future. And the security holes created when difficult changes are ignored can be easy for automated hacker tools to exploit. Perhaps just as importantly, too much reliance on DIY processes leaves too little time for IT to focus on more strategic projects. To get an idea of how much IT staff time is spent on manual and ad hoc changes, consider the example of one very large US-based software vendor who contracted our company for help to automate its privileged account management. This software developer has some of the best IT staff in the industry, and they were able to tell us that it took fully 240 of their IT staff hours to change a single privileged service account manually the right way inside their data center. As you probably know, properly changing a Windows service account password means discovering everywhere the service is in use, stopping all other dependent services in the right order, changing every instance of the service credential, and restarting all dependent services again in the proper order. Failure to complete any one of these steps the right way can lead to a service outage, so it's easy to believe their figure of 240 hours for a single service. Multiply this by the many different services on the company's network, and you can see how they made the business case to get rid of DIY processes and automate the management of their privileged accounts. So with that, let's move on to your audit trap number 3. This next trap we'll call the temporary worker trap, even though the risks can arise from anyone in IT whose job role has changed. We'll define this trap as failure to consistently revoke contractor or employee privileged access when there's no longer an immediate business need. You'll know if your company could be at risk when you rely on vendor contracts as a primary way to control their privileged access without real automated safeguards, or if you have difficulty documenting which of your contractors has access to your systems and data, or if you've ever found audit logs that show access that you can't easily explain. Again, there are plenty of regulatory guidelines that address your need to safeguard privileged access by outside personnel and to immediately revoke those logins for anyone who no longer has a business need. Yet we found that a great many organizations seem to assume that their vendor contracts and written policies alone are enough to keep the network safe. As a VP at a large financial institution once told our engineer, we control access by firing anyone who doesn't follow our policies. But to put real numbers around this problem, our recent survey found that 1/3 of IT professionals said that if they were to leave their jobs, they could still access sensitive information inside their organization. And that's a big potential risk. And the outcomes could include spreading of your organization's password secrets outside the company, a greater risk for data loss, and of course, your inability to document who really has access. And as you've probably seen from a great many news stories, incidents involving breaches by third parties, contractors, and employees who leave the company are among the most common. In our own experience, Lieberman Software was once contacted by a U.S. financial institution that discovered its own privileged logins had been published on an internet hacker board by a fired IT administrator. The organization needed to immediately change all the privileged logins that this individual could have possibly known, and needed to enact auditing controls right away to make sure the new processes were effective. Fortunately, automated tools are available to secure administrator logins, service accounts, and application-to-application passwords. we were able to help the organization quickly secure its network, put in place real auditing controls, and prevent any data loss from this instance of the temporary worker trap. And with that, let's talk about the next audit trap in our countdown. We're up to number 2. Our engineers named this a lazy admin trap, but in truth this risk could apply to anyone in IT who is overworked enough to take shortcuts when it comes to privileged account security. We'll define the lazy admin trap as any of your practices that allow IT staff to circumvent security for the sake of convenience. And if you work in IT, these symptoms are easy to recognize. For example, if your staff has learned to avoid changing highly privileged logins to save extra work, or if they seem to reuse many of the passwords that grant too much access, or if admin logins seem to be used more frequently than you'd expect, either by people inside of IT or by others in the company with shared knowledge. If these symptoms are present, you might also find that few of your audit logs have actionable information as a result of these shared accounts. And of course, these practices are forbidden by IT auditing standards. For example, payment card industry standards and others require absolute links between individuals and their logins. And nearly all of these standards require you to change privileged passwords on a regular basis and to use these logins only with the least privilege required for each task. Again, we found that too many companies rely on written policies to control the spread of privileged logins, trusting their IT staff to comply and assuming that auditors won't notice when knowledge of these accounts spreads. One of our engineers found a surprising example at a very large insurance company. Some time ago, an administrator shared a common local admin password used at the company's sales offices with a few individuals outside of IT. As a result, the company eventually discovered literally thousands of unauthorized, potentially unlicensed applications installed at offices all over the country. Needless to say, there was a big concern about security risks and the possibility of so many entry points for malware and other threats. Of course, these kinds of lapses also lead to anonymous data access, a loss of accountability, and the potential for a data breach. And beyond the sharing of passwords, there are many other types of casual behaviors that can introduce risk and cause trouble with IT auditors. Our engineers were recently engaged with a multinational hotel chain where an IT audit revealed the same highly privileged service account was in use on more than 700 of the company's database servers. The hotel's executive staff approved new automated controls because they knew that this could quickly get the organization back into compliance and eliminate this type of potentially dangerous shortcut. So with that, let's reveal our top audit trap. Regardless of the size of your organization, you've almost certainly seen audit trap number 1, and it's what we call the network creep trap. We'll define network creep as an organization's failure to account for privileged identity security holes introduced by new and changed systems and applications. Some aspects of network creep can be very difficult to detect because you may not know where all the security holes have appeared on your network as a result of new applications, computers, appliances, and so on. But the symptoms you are likely to see can include basic network scans that reveal you don't know where all of your privileged accounts reside, disagreement among your IT staff when they report your numbers of privileged user logins, service accounts, IT assets, and so on, and of course a reluctance to change highly privileged service and application credentials out of a concern that all the interdependencies might not be known and service disruptions could result. For most organizations, it's almost certain that you've got applications and devices on your network right now that can grant access to private data using easily cracked or even published passwords. And while all of the major IT regulatory guidelines say that you've got to change every pre-configured login on each new device or application that appears on your network, the truth is that these simple-sounding requirements can be almost impossible to meet without automation. Many organizations try to deal with this problem through contracts that place the burden on their IT vendors, but the results aren't always what you'd expect. The fact is that networks are constantly changing, and without the right automation, you might not be aware of new privileged logins, service accounts, application-to-application passwords, and even the developer backdoors that are introduced by business applications, computers, and network devices. Organizations that don't know where to find these highly privileged accounts and how to map their interdependencies face a risk of widely known and easily guessed logins granting highly privileged access present on their production networks. They also face a potential for service disruptions if they attempt to change service or application account credentials and fail to account for all the dependencies. In one recent example, our company was engaged with a national healthcare provider based on the West Coast. To demonstrate the risk of network creep, Our engineers showed how to take control of a server in their data center using a published default password that granted access through a lights-out management card. It was possible to open an administrator's console, access data, and even power off the machine using a password that anyone could find online. And of course, it isn't just these kinds of hardware devices that can introduce new threats. Nearly all network appliances, business applications, computer OSs, and any other IT asset can introduce new security holes. Fortunately, organizations have discovered that privileged identity management software can automate the task of securing all these accounts. It takes just 4 basic steps to regain control of privileged identities. These steps are easy to remember because they're abbreviated as IDEA. First, it's essential to identify all the privileged identities that are present on your network, whether on server or desktop operating systems, network appliances, line of business applications, and so on. And you've got to understand which of these identities are interdependent so that when you change the credentials of one account, you know to update the dependent accounts to avoid lockouts and service disruptions. Next, you'll want to delegate access to these accounts so that only appropriate personnel can log into critical IT assets, always in a timely manner, whenever needed, over a secure communication channel, using the least privilege required to reduce the potential for damaging errors, with a documented purpose, and only during designated times. It's also essential to enforce rules for password strength, uniqueness so that a password can't be reused except where absolutely necessary, and change frequency, synchronizing all these changes across dependent processes. Finally, having the right auditing and alerting controls makes individuals accountable for privileged access, sets the right organizational tone, and alerts management to any unusual events. Enterprise Random Password Manager, the privileged identity management solution from Lieberman Software, discovers, strengthens, monitors, and allows secure recovery of all local, domain, and process account passwords on your network. And ERPM helps organizations lower their cost and uncertainty of complying with the privileged account requirements of the Consensus Audit Guidelines, PCI DSS, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, and others. ERPM is developed and maintained solely in the U.S. by Lieberman Software through our offices in Los Angeles, California, and Austin, Texas. Our company is U.S. management owned, consistently profitable, and has a track record of delivering products that are focused on long-term customer value. And our software integrates with the industry leaders in directory services, data access, and management frameworks, including Cisco, HP, IBM, Microsoft, Novell, Oracle, and many others. Today, our products have more than 1,200 enterprise customers. And we offer qualified organizations great options to evaluate Enterprise Random Password Manager, including evaluation software that's easy to install, configure, and maintain, or an online sandbox environment where you can explore ERPM features any way you choose, or one-on-one sessions with our engineers to show you the product in depth on your network based on your requirements. And with that, I'd like to extend an offer to visit liebsoft.com/TRAPS, where you can download a free executive overview, get a copy of today's presentation, and learn the details of our free risk assessment offer. Our free risk assessment is provided to qualified organizations and uses ERPM Discovery to document privileged account vulnerabilities on your network. The risk assessment includes a detailed report that shows any undocumented administrator logins, unsecured systems and application accounts, stale, highly privileged logins that could be the result of personnel turnover, and many other issues. And now I'd like to open our session to any questions.